All right. Well, we're going to talk about a very, very practical and common subject. How many had their views changed by this study on divorce and remarriage? Had your views changed or modified at all? So how many had your views solidified? So how many feel like it's going to be a burden knowing this information? All right. Well, the first passage that you dealt with was Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 1, right? And it says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. And I've highlighted the word indecency because that's kind of a key term here, right?
Yes.
What does this word mean? Now, we could look this up in Webster's, right? But would that do us any good?
No.
No, because Webster's is English. And we need to get back to what it means in the Greek or the Hebrew, depending on whether it's Old Testament or New Testament. So this is where our Logos Bible software can be of help to us. Did you want to say something, Jeff?
No.
So we're going to just do a little exercise. You go to Deuteronomy 24. Right? It brings up the Bible, brings up a commentary. We're going to forget about that commentary because we're learning to think for ourselves. We're learning to chew on our own food. Not that we're not interested in the desserts that other people offer. Now, here's the word indecency, right? Now, in Logos, if you put your pointer over it, it will give you what is from the Strong's Concordance or something like that. You can see Strong's at the bottom there. But we're going to learn to go beyond that. So I'm going to click this, and I'm going to go to the ESV English Hebrew parallel. So when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor, and favor's okay, it's, you know, likeness, it's even a word that's used for love in his eyes, because he has found, and here's the word indecency. All right, when I get a full library, I can right click that. I can go down to what is called a key link. A key link is something that you create that opens up what you think are the best books. And of course, we'll be teaching you what are the best books. And it brings up here the Hebrew lexicon or the Hebrew dictionary. And it says nakedness or pudenda. Pudenda is an old word which basically refers to a person's genitals. And so if you see, now here's an interesting use of it. Let's open that up. Genesis 9:22. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. So, there we go. We're back to it. In Leviticus, if there is a man who takes his sister, his father's daughter, of his mother's daughter, so that he sees her nakedness. Now you got to understand, this is a euphemism for sexual activity, for rape or sexual aggression or sexual activity or something like that. So now we're getting a better understanding of what it means. I closed that one. Here's the Dictionary of Biblical Languages with semantic domains. So it talks about indecency, a repulsiveness. It talks about the private, personal parts of the body, especially the external sexual organs. Here's another one. This is the Vines Expository Dictionary. Now, Vines is around. It's a good English. Even those who don't know Greek or Hebrew can benefit from Vines. The word is often used of female nakedness, the uncovered sexual organs, and is symbolic of shame. So, the phrase indecent thing represents an uncleanness in a military camp or any violation of the laws of sexual abstinence, so on and so forth. So when we're talking about the husband seeing some indecency in her, we're talking about of a sexual nature or maybe sexual violation. Part of the problem is that the Jewish writers wanted to turn this into such a broad definition that it was anything that displeased him, and it made divorce something that was very, very easy to do. It also meant that divorce could be held as a, kind of a club over the woman, because to divorce a woman and send her into society was to put her out almost helpless, because there just wasn't the job market, quote unquote. There was some of those old jobs that have been around since the beginning, but those are not the ones that provided any kind of a safety or lifestyle. It says he gives her a certificate of divorce. So we've seen what it means in the Hebrew. Now, one of the things that we mentioned to you is very often, most often, the New Testament writers used the Greek translation of the Bible. So when I study, I go one step further. I want to know what is the Greek translation of this old Hebrew, because sometimes that gives me a little bit more insight. So if I go here and I click the source again, and you will have this source also. There is a source called the Lexham Greek English Interlinear Septuagint. If I click that, it brings up the same passage in the Greek, which would have been the main usage of the early church, using the Greek Bible more than the Hebrew Bible. But of course, Jesus is quoting this also, which means he probably knows the Hebrew fairly well. So, but here it says, has found any shame in her. If I look at that as a Greek word, it says that which is not only openly done, displayed, or discussed in reserved society because it is considered shameful. This is a word especially applied to sexual matters in, this would be classical Greek or non-biblical Greek. So it's talking about some kind of sexual exposure that has brought public shame or disgust in society. So we're talking about something that's probably, fairly serious. So those are the kinds of tools that you will have in the coming days. Now, I'm sure there's at least one person sitting out there and saying, but Dr. McLean, we could have known all of that. And I say, I understand. I'm just trying to earn my money. So we don't expect you to maybe find all that. But under what circumstances, let's answer the questions. Under what circumstances could a man divorce his wife? Let me get those questions up here for that assignment. So we go through them.
Why is it always the one?
Pardon me?
Why is it always the one?
Why is it always the woman?
It wasn't always the woman.
The men are saying it wasn't always the woman.
That's all they're talking about.
No, there's a passage that tells about a woman.
Yeah, I know,
being divorced.
but most of it's women.
You know, it is true that it was in some ways a patriarchal society, even though the women, ruled. So, when and why can a person divorce or separate according to this passage? Okay, when the man finds some indecency in his wife. What are the consequences of the divorce?
Not being able to take her back.
He can't take her back, and he has to give her a certificate of divorce. Eric?
Great.
Pardon me? Or Greg, yeah, Coleman.
Well, he can't take her back if she remarries. He can take her back if she doesn't remarry someone else.
Correct. Right. If she remarries somebody else, she can't be taken back. Thank you, Greg. Where is Eric tonight? Maybe that's why Eric's not here tonight. So,
Dr. McLean?
yes.
They also said in that, along with that same idea, that she would consider as being defiled.
Yes, by the other man. Yes, that is a consequence. What does the text say about remarriage?
As far as the Old Testament?
As just the Deuteronomy passage. Jesse?
I wrote, the text plainly says there is no remarriage if the divorced woman marries another. It's
Right.
silent on the subject.
No remarriage if she marries another man. Is there any statement of God's view of divorce in this passage? No direct statement. All right. Let's go to our next passage.
Well, isn't there it's an abomination for the Lord? Isn't that?
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's an abomination for her to go back, right?
Yeah.
Then her former husband who sent her away is not allowed to take her again to be his wife since she has been defiled. That is what Clarence said, as in marrying the other man. For that is an abomination before the Lord. Yes. So the remarriage to the husband would be an abomination. Yes.
But it doesn't say that she would be committing adultery.
Doesn't say that here. It just says defiled. Mike?
Well, it says that he can't take her back to be his wife since she has been defiled. So isn't the defilement in the fact that she married somebody else?
Yes. The marrying another person is a defilement.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Yep. All right.
But it doesn't say that he can't be married.
No, it doesn't say anything about him. So, because he has divorced her for indecency. And again, that becomes a key term that, everybody will focus on. That's why I took you to the Hebrew, took you to the Septuagint, just to give you a little background. Now, Matthew 5 is a little shorter, isn't it? It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity, the different word, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. All right, let's go see this Matthew 5, what was it? 31. Yes, 31 and 32. Whoever sends his wife away, so on and so forth. Okay, so we can put in our ESV interlinear. Here is the word except, yeah, for the unchastity. We've got to get to there. Yes, in verse 32. Now, here is the word unchastity. It's going to be a word that sounds familiar to you. Porneia. We get our word pornography. But it doesn't mean that she was a pole dancer or anything like that. It just is, a lot of our words in English are built off of Latin and Greek and so on and so forth. So what does porneia mean? Execute the key link. It says unlawful, And by unlawful, it means God's laws. Unlawful sexual intercourse, prostitution, unchastity, fornication. All right? There's a second one, participation in prohibited degrees of marriage, or things like that. So, we're talking here about, quote unquote, we would use the word adultery, sometimes in English, fornication, prostitution. All of those things are within that category.
Dr. John?
Yes.
Do you feel like they watered down the word unchastity compared
Well,
to every other version?
It's a part of the old, the early New American Standard. And what word did you want to use?
Isn't it fornication in another?
Yeah, fornication. See, you could use the word adultery,
Yeah, adultery.
but fornication is a little broader term that means a sexual sin outside of God's ordained principle, which is one man and one woman for life. So, in this passage, when and why can a person divorce or separate? For unchastity. What are the consequences of divorce?
Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Yeah, there's one you don't hear a lot. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for fornication, makes her commit adultery. The assumption, I think, being that she's going to get remarried. So if a man divorces his wife and she is innocent, and she remarries again, what is that happening there? It's an adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, if the man divorces his wife for the wrong reason and marries another, is he committing adultery?
Yes.
All right. Yes, Mike.
In a question like that, so you got two people who are Christians, they get married, they divorce for a reason other than sexual infidelity.
Right.
Then spouse A marries another Christian.
Right.
Now the person who's left single, are they locked in forever at that point?
Well, those are practical questions that we're going to answer. Yes, Beth.
Aren't the sexes interchangeable in all these cases?
You know, I don't think we can yet say they're interchangeable. In other words, you mean if a woman divorces a man, I don't think we can yet say that they're interchangeable. But by the time we're done, we can, yes. Yes. You know, if a woman divorces her husband, and if it isn't for fornication, then I think the same dominoes fall. But as we get into other verses, then we see that the principle goes the other way too. All right? Now we got a little longer passage, and the context is a little different, isn't it? Some of the Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking. So now we've got this controversy that we know about historically from the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, of which much is written, and we have those records. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? Now, see, that's the broad interpretation of indecency from the Old Testament. He answered and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them Eve and Steve? No, how's that go? Adam and Steve or something? No, it's male and female. And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. See, the Pharisees aren't asking about fornication. They're asking about anything. And Jesus' answer is basically what? No. Right? They said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, because of your hardness of heart, Moses, and what word does Jesus use? Permitted. See, Moses didn't command divorce. He commanded protection. Go ahead.
Okay, this one just doesn't settle too well with me, because in Malachi, God says, I hate divorce.
Yes.
And yet Moses codifies into law something that God hates on the basis of the hardness of heart. He doesn't challenge them.
No, that's right. Well,
he says, look, we're going to let this one fly under the radar.
No. Because the law is to protect the woman. See, that's the point. The law restrains sin. The law tries to control sin. But the law does not endorse sin. Does that make a difference?
Yes.
Yes.
Why can't you say that?
So everybody can hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Why can't you say that the law, that the interpretation of the hardness of your hearts was the way that they put away their wives? That the custom of the day was a man could literally throw a woman out with the clothes she had on, and that's what God hated, the way that they did that, the way they did not take care of. Because in other passages, it talks about
God hating divorce.
Well, one, God hating divorce, but also it talks about how a woman can get a divorce, under what circumstances she can get a divorce in Exodus. And how would you not, if you don't know which way to interpret it, how would you know to say that he hates getting a divorce, or he hates the way that they were doing it back then? He hates the abuse of the woman.
Well, in Malachi, it says God hates divorce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's just a short, curt statement.
Right.
But you'll have to remind me of the Exodus passage with the women. But let me finish this one, and then we'll keep going. But because of your hardness of heart. Now, what is the hardness of the heart? Who has the hard heart?
The husband.
The husband. Why is the heart hard?
Because he stopped on that. He don't love
Stop loving his wife.
He stops loving, stops forgiving, stops caring. So Jesus is saying there's another sin here. A very serious sin, isn't it? It's the hardness of the heart that does not provide any protection or care or concern for the wife. You read it in, it wasn't in Malachi about forsaking the wife of your youth?
Yeah.
So you can see why we did these assignments together. Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. See, God's desire is one man, one woman for life. But the law is designed to control, to restrict, to harness sin. As it says, well, it's improperly understood. My spirit shall not always strive against man. It's a bad translation, so we won't go there. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Now, in the previous one, the word we had was what? Unchastity. Now we have immorality. So we have to ask ourselves, are we talking about the same passage? And so this passage is Matthew, what verse was it?
9.
Yeah. All right. For immorality. So we do our ESV, and we see it's what? Porneia. Same word. Stylistically different. So, but those are the kinds of questions you do have to ask yourself when you're looking at the English text. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality, and marries another woman, then he does what? Commits adultery. So that answers that question that we had before, right? Yes.
off base, but since it's the same word, why don't the translators just use the same word when they translate?
I prefer that. I prefer that. But they were all brought up probably in English schools that said, don't use the same word, use synonyms when you're writing because it makes it more interesting, so on and so forth. So, all right, so when and why can a person divorce in this situation? Let's answer these questions and I'll take questions.
Fornication.
Fornication. What are the consequences of divorce? If there's, adultery, because I think it's assuming remarriage. What does the text say about remarriage? It's adultery. What is God's view of divorce? Hates it, doesn't want it. All right, Beth?
Safe to assume that there's no implication in any of these, that if there is immorality, there should be a divorce?
There's no command to divorce. Is that what? Yeah, there's no command to divorce. There's no command to divorce. The divorce is permitted. So, now, and we're going to get into all the practical things of it. I love this from the disciples. This is men, Francine.
Yeah.
Men at their worst.
Yeah.
The disciples said to him, if the relationship of the man with his wife is like this, it is better not to marry. You know? I mean, that is really crass. That shows you where they're at. But Jesus said to them, not all men can accept this statement, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who are born that way from their mother's womb. There are eunuchs who are made eunuchs by men. Those were usually the kings that had the men protect their wives. And there are also eunuchs who made themselves eunuchs. Boy, that's a commitment to the kingdom of Christ. For the sake of the kingdom. He who is able, accept this, let him accept it. So what is that saying? A mouthful. Pardon me?
You're better off not marrying.
No.
Unless you have the desires.
Right.
And you cannot control the desires, then as we get into the Corinthian passage, Paul says better to marry than to burn.
Okay, now
What is
here's
the
my
eunuch?
question. though.
Explain the eunuch.
Go ahead, huh?
The eunuchs. Well, explain that part.
Well, when it says, for there are eunuchs who are born that way, there are some men who are born with, sexual reproductive problems or genitalia problems, and we're going to see in Corinthians that there's a gift that a few men are given, that they just don't have that desire for sexual behavior. I've only met a few of them in my whole life. I have met a few, though. I'll come to you, Chris. The second one is there were eunuchs that were made eunuchs. In other words, kings very often castrated and mutilated men that were going to be serving around their harem or whatever. And believe it or not, there were some who just did it themselves. So, Chris?
What does it say about procreation, though, for people who follow God?
Well,
Would
this
it
is...
better for them to be in this situation.
What situation?
Well, like a eunuch, or to be not married, or not have, wives. And then how...
Oh, no. But understand, what Jesus is saying to them is, no, you are wrong. It is better to be married.
Okay.
Because Jesus is actually correcting them.
Okay.
They're saying, man, if you can't divorce and I'm stuck for life, then it's better not to marry.
Okay.
And Jesus coming back and saying, no, man, you ain't built that way. I didn't create you that way. So, and all God's men said, amen. All right, Phil?
So when we're talking about hermeneutics, one of the things we've talked about is understanding something in the context.
Yes.
In this, like in the Matthew 5 context, and he's talking about the kingdom living, the rules for living in the kingdom, or the character of being in the kingdom, one that's in the kingdom, a follower of him in the kingdom. It seems like he's juxtapositioning the external versus the internal. They said they were doing all the things right.
Well, are you
from
going
outside.
back to Matthew 5, 6, and 7?
Yeah.
All right.
So-
That I'm going with.
And so then, it seems to me that he's not necessarily getting in on the particulars of the divorce. What he's trying to do is look at a person's what he wants them to do is look at what their motives are.
Well, I mean, in this particular passage, Jesus is entering into a theological or controversy, a cultural controversy.
Right, and he's doing it in the very area where John the Baptist was killed, and because he pointed out that Herod had married his half-brother's wife.
Oh, later on. Uh-huh.
So if I'm looking at things in the cultural context,
Right.
things were going on, why wouldn't someone be able to fairly say that he's really not trying to answer the question? He's not willing to be drawn into a trap because his time had not come.
Well, he answered their question by going all the way back to creative order and saying they were wrong.
But isn't he saying that you're focused on the wrong thing?
I think to me he's saying you are assuming divorce is right, and it's not. Divorce is allowed because of the hardness of heart.
But isn't this written, the purpose of this story being given, isn't it to show that he's the Messiah?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, I mean,
Matthew, we've talked
no,
about that.
Matthew's not just about Messiah. Matthew is about Jesus correcting the Judaism of the day, which was not the covenant faith of the Old Testament. And so over and over again, he's constantly correcting. You've heard the Pharisees say, you see them do this, but I say to you this. So there's a constant correction in Matthew, and part of what Matthew is all about is explaining to the Jews why the kingdom hasn't come and why they're going to be judged, why judgment is coming.
And that's because of their heart.
Oh, at the base of it all is, you honor me with your lips, but your heart is far from me. Beth?
What is that whole practice of if your brother dies, then you take his wife, and then if you die, she passes on to another brother, and how does all that fit? How did they get there?
Well, that's from the Old Testament, levirate marriage. The protection of the woman, it's the protection of the woman and the protection of the inheritance within the tribe.
But that to me is so clearly against everything God set up with Adam and Eve and make one man, one woman. How did they get to that point to say that was okay or that was right?
That's an Old Testament question that I'll have to deal with later, because we're not going to get to the practical questions if I don't keep going.
But if the can we talk about the Exodus passage?
Right.
The Exodus passage says that
Exodus what?
21, 9 and 10. That a woman has a right to divorce if her husband does not take care of her food, her clothing, and her sexual needs. Exodus 21, 9 and 10. I think.
9 and 10.
Starts at passage 7. I think that the whole passage starts at 7. So about
If a man sells his daughter as a female slave, she is not free to go as the male slaves do. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who designated her for herself, then she shall... I'll have to look at that again.
Because it's not talking about slavery. It's talking about being a wife, because it goes on and talks about her conjugal rights in verse 10. So it's not just a slave. It's if basically you're letting your daughter become a bride to somebody.
Yeah, it may be a concubine. I'll have to look at that one later on.
Okay.
So that I can... All right, let me because we got discussions within the discussion, we're going to lose me. All right, Mark 10. Some Pharisees came to Jesus testing him, very similar to Matthew, began to question him whether it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. he answered and said to them, what did Moses command you? They said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. So they're learning something here, right? This is, you chronologically have to look at this discussion, because in the last discussion, it's Jesus that told them that Moses permitted, right? So then, Jesus is, again, but Jesus said, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you the command, but from the beginning of creation, so on and so forth. What therefore God has joined together, let no man keep asunder. In the house, the disciples began questioning him about this. He said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. This is what gives us the backflow for the other side, right?
Yes.
Brings the parallel. Chris?
Okay, now wouldn't you say that verse 9 is very key to this whole passage? And then also, there is no acceptance because of adultery.
Acceptance in what sense?
Acceptance of divorce at all. There is no exception to the rule in this passage. From the
Yes,
gospel.
right. No. Mark leaves it out.
Yes.
Now, Matthew includes it because his is more of a Jewish audience. The Gentiles aren't going to necessarily understand all the Jewish background of it, some would say. But when you have a shorter passage and you have a longer passage, hermeneutics teaches that you go with the longer passage because it's the fuller explanation. I'll say that again. When you have a short passage and then you have a longer passage, you generally go with the longer passage that provides you more information because it's a more complete discussion. So that even though Mark doesn't mention adultery here, it still has to be a part of our final equation. Aaron?
Now, are you saying Mark and Matthew, are they the same conversation? Because I don't get that because
No.
Okay.
No, they're probably different conversations. And one of the things you have to ask yourself is, how many times did Jesus address these issues? How many times did he tell the same parables over and over again? I mean, it's like somebody who's a Christian apologist who goes to a university campus. Every university campus is going to ask the same basic 10 questions. He's going to spend his whole life being able to answer 10 basic questions. It's not that hard a job when you got the same audience asking the same questions all the time. I don't mean to demean them, but I'm just saying it's like, friends of mine that were evangelists. Every Sunday they preach the same 1, 2, 3, or 4 messages. It's not as hard as being a pastor or a Bible teacher where you're doing fresh material all the time or whatever. So there's so many practical things leak into the class here, aren't there? All God's students said. Amen. All right, but the observation is Mark leaves that part out, doesn't he?
Yeah.
All right, let's, then Luke gets right to the point. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. Yes?
I'm sorry, but now I got to come back to this again.
You don't have to
Now
be sorry.
We have 2 gospels
Right.
that omit it.
Yes.
And this gospel is very clear. It says everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And then if we go back to the Old Testament, we see the defiled wife.
Right.
Who's marrying another man. She's already defiled.
Right.
So does that still lend us to go back to the longer passage, hermeneutically?
Well, you still have to go back to the longer passage, but the question is, is there anything in Matthew 5:31 that explicitly permits remarriage? I think I'm going to answer your question that way. It's the answer is no, right?
Exactly.
And in Matthew 19, is there anything explicitly here that states that you can remarry? No. So you're left to what is implied. Now, we come to our last, not our last passage, but yeah, it's the last passage for this. So, now, in this one, we have a different situation. We're talking about not the gospel era or the Old Testament era, but we're talking about the New Covenant era, right?
Yes.
Because in all of the others, Jesus is talking to within the context of the Old Covenant. Now, here we are in the New Covenant. Should that make any difference hermeneutically?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it should have some influence. So here we're talking about, I'm going to set the background. You can disagree with it if you'd like. We're talking about two non-believers. One becomes a believer, and they have tension over the faith of the believer. We're not talking about two believers to start with here. We're not talking about a believer who marries a non-believer. Because if a believer marries a non-believer, they have already violated God's scriptures, right?
I would say on the later portion.
On the what?
On the later portion, definitely. But on the first portion from 7, I don't see that. So
See what?
I don't see how you're saying that they're two non-believers. Because it addresses just the married.
Right.
It's giving instructions to. And he's saying, not I, but the Lord.
Right.
So thereby, those people must believe in the Lord to begin with. Because these are the Christians from the Lord.
Well, he's writing to Christians.
So his subject are two married people.
Right.
Who are both believers.
Right. Who are both believers? No. I don't think so.
Why?
The one's a non-believer.
How do you know that?
Well, we'll go through. But to the married I give instruction, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, or that the husband should not divorce his wife. So the first thing he says is, you got to avoid divorce. If you do divorce, you can't remarry, right?
Yes, but here's my thing.
Yeah.
If he has to have an audience. If they're both non-believers, he has no audience.
Well, they're not both non-believers.
But that's what you're saying.
No, I say they started out as non-believers.
Okay.
I'm stating I believe that they started out as non-believers and one becomes a believer.
And how do you explain number 12 where it says, but to the rest I say?
But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if a brother has a wife who is an unbeliever.
Yeah, I think that's where he starts addressing where one is a believer and one's not. I tend to think
Right.
that in the top class.
You're talking about 10 and 11.
Yeah, I think
Yes,
there's a
yes,
distinction.
I don't disagree with that.
Okay,
That he's saying believers don't divorce.
okay.
Right. But to the married I give instruction, not I, but the Lord, that the wife, and I would take that as a believer, should not leave her husband.
Right.
But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, not the Lord, meaning he didn't get direct conversation with Jesus about this, that if a brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and she consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. In other words, the believer is not to divorce the non-believer. Pardon me?
If they can agree, right? I mean, if they can't, if they can agree, it's all right.
If they're what?
If they cannot agree, it's all right for them to divorce, right? If they.
The believer is not to divorce the non-believer. That's what I'm reading here.
Yes.
The believer isn't to
Only
divorce,
if they have
period.
peace, right?
the believer isn't to divorce, period.
Whether you're married to a Christian.
Right,
not.
or a non-Christian. You're not to divorce. And now this is a difficult one, but I mean it's easy to explain when you understand sanctified. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. Now sanctified doesn't mean saved. Because remember as we get to the end, it says, how do you know your spouse will be saved? But there is a sanctifying, there is a holy, there is a God influence. And this is particularly mentioned in the Peter epistle when it talks about wives with disobedient or unbelieving husbands. In the Peter passage, you got to decide, is disobedient meaning unbelieving? I take it as unbelieving, not just disobedient, but he's an unbeliever. She's got to win him without a word by living the word and speaking a word to him with her life. So, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. The unbelieving wife is sanctified through her husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. In other words, there is a sanctifying effect on the children. Yet, if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases. Now, that's the key phrase. What does it mean, not under bondage? Are they free to remarry?
Yeah.
No.
But God has called us to peace. Now, what does that mean? I'll tell you how I take it. If an unbeliever is going to leave the believer, what is the value of fighting it? Of creating greater animosity or tension or discord or whatever? You're going to, in a sense, maybe alienate, make things worse. God has called us to peace. If you can't stop it, you can't stop it. You're better off letting it go, and maybe without so much tension or alienation, you might be able to then even have a reconciliation. Now, over the years, I have had couples separate for the purpose of reconciliation rather than see them divorce. I've had women separate for their protection, so on and so forth.
Yes, sir.
Verse 16, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So we know that sanctified doesn't mean saved. So here, divorce is permitted in a situation, but the question is, you are not under bondage. What does that mean? So, now, there are those, and I think that they can make a solid argument, that when they are not under bondage, then they are the innocent party who is not under obligation, and therefore as the innocent party, they are allowed to remarry. I'll get to you in a second. They are allowed to remarry. What generally I have counseled in the past is do not remarry until the partner that has left you has entered into another marriage or into another relationship that clearly violates the scriptures of fornication or remarriage, and where there cannot be a restoration and reconciliation. So this is the main passage where I see an opening or a possibility of remarriage. There are others who say, no, the remarriage is still adultery. All right, so now I turned somebody away and said I would get to them.
That was me.
Charnay?
Gloria.
Or Gloria. I'm sorry, Gloria Allen.
Yes.
Chardonnay's in front of you.
You said that in this case, the person not under bondage would be free, the innocent party.
Right.
Well, in the previous verses, the one who was divorced without cause, aren't they innocent?
When you say, you gotta tell me which verses you're talking about.
Okay.
Are you talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
And, well, you found it at Jesus. When it doesn't like in Luke 6:18.
Right. Yeah. See, Gloria, this is what I'm saying. We have to look at Old Covenant, because Jesus is talking to those that are still under the law. The Christian faith hasn't been instituted, so on and so forth. So, still under the law, and here we're talking about a new covenant a situation. Again, where one of them, and I make this assumption that, see, if it was a non-believer marrying a believer, a believer marrying a non-believer, that in itself is sin and wrong. Therefore, the believer should never divorce the non-believer. But if you have what was very common in the church, and even happens today, where you've got two non-believers, one becomes a Christian, and the non-believer says, forget it. I don't want anything to do with your faith. I don't like this new person. I like the old, party person. And if you're not going to party anymore, then we're done. And they walk away. The terminology, the sister is not under bondage, was a term that was used of a contract being nullified, set aside, no longer in existence. It's similar to the terminology that's used in Romans when Paul says that if a woman's husband dies, then she is no longer under the law, she is no longer under that bondage, but she is free to marry again. And that is one of the windows that is there. Yes,
What about
Rod?
What about abandonment? Abandonment of marriage, meaning.
Right. Oh, okay. We'll get into practical questions in just a minute. But we'll. Do we have any more about the text? And then we'll start practical questions. Chessie and then Mike.
Okay. Since this is the New Testament,
right,
the New Covenant, and it doesn't mention anything about allowing divorce for adultery.
Right.
And the statement of Jesus was supposed to be the Old Testament.
Well, again, it was within the context of pre-Christian. Go ahead.
Yeah. So,
but it was pre-Christian. But what does he always take it back to? Genesis theology. Yeah. Very good. So that we have that foundational principle there. So go ahead.
So, how does one interpret that you can get divorced for adultery within the New Covenant?
And I would say, because Jesus takes it back to Genesis theology, that divorce is permitted for fornication.
Because their marriage was created without the possibility of fornication.
Right.
It was just one man, one woman.
Right.
When that principle is violated,
right,
you have violated the marriage.
Right. And if fornication happens and the heart, but see again, here the hardness of heart. Can you forgive? And I understand that is deep. To forgive, that is to dig down to the deepest wells of grace and mercy. And not only forgive, but then to try to build that trust back again. I understand all that, but the scriptures say that can be done. I've seen that done. But if a hard heart sets in, then divorce is permitted, but it doesn't say that remarriage is permitted. What I'm saying in the Corinthian passage is the only one that I see that opens a window maybe for remarriage. So we got Mike, and Kim.
Real quick, how much of what Jesus says to the Pharisees should be looked at in light of Jewish betrothal customs? You know, Joseph and Mary being
Right.
betrothed, they're together, but they don't have sex for
Right.
however long that is.
And that's a good point, because it says, see, that's at the betrothal. And it says, Joseph, being a righteous man, was going to put her away.
But
You
weren't
see,
they considered to be married at that point? At the point
but the wedding night was the consummation, and you remember in the Old Testament passage, if a man came into his wife on the night of consummation and believed that she was not a virgin and brought charges against her after the fact, because usually he didn't stop having sex with her, he'd have sex with her and then get rid of her. That's just the way it is. It said that the mother and the father had to bring out the blood sheet, right, to prove him wrong. That's why the rabbis joked on the wedding night, many a goat died.
Right.
So they'd have some blood for the blanket. So that's in case you didn't get that. So, all right, Mike?
Just for clarification, you said the party that's not under bondage is the believer or the non-believer?
The believer.
The believer. So the believer can remarry and...
That is the understanding of not under bondage. Okay. The innocent believer.
Okay.
Right. And Kim?
Okay, with the woman's defilement, how do Hosea, the prophet Hosea, fit in there?
Well, you have to be more specific for me. Hosea and Gomer, you mean?
Yes.
In that he marries a woman and then she commits adultery on him?
Exactly. Prostitution.
Well, it's the example of God, by His grace, telling this prophet, you've got to go back and still love and forgive and reach out and buy her back.
Exactly. So you could basically say the premise and understanding marriage, the representation of Christ and the church.
No. Well, yeah, okay, go ahead.
I'm saying the representation of Christ
Yeah.
and the church. Even with the Malachi study, everything, how man felt everything that God asked, Jesus fulfilled everything for the covenant. Even in the marriage, the Jewish nation and even man, in this simple way, still fell.
Right.
Christ,
Yeah, I mean,
the representation of the
Jesus
church.
loved the church, gave himself up for her. Yes. Yep. But those passages are peripheral to our main discussion, which mentions these specifically. All right, now let's think about practical questions. Not practical, or case studies or whatever. So, Chessie?
Even though it doesn't say anything about it, what about two people who were married, they were not Christians.
Two people, yes.
They get divorced.
Right.
Then later on, one of them or both of them become Christians.
Right.
What will be the situation in that?
Right. So you got two non-believers, they're divorced as non-believers, then they become Christians. Can they remarry? All right. The Bible doesn't address that specifically. Some would say if anybody be in Christ, they're new creatures. So they get a new start. Now, for the Arminian folks who believe that you can lose your salvation and get resaved again, this is kind of a constant open door. In fact, when they got divorced, they'd lose their salvation and so on and so forth. But the scriptures don't address that specifically, so that what you end up with is, you say, well, does the theology apply? If anyone be in Christ, they're a new creature. Can that man then become an elder in a church? Can he become a pastor? Because we've also got that question of a husband of one wife. What does that mean? So, and the question also comes into, okay, so they got divorced when they were non-believers. Did they marry other people when they were non-believers? And then, so there's lots of variables there that the scriptures don't specifically address. So, yes?
Okay, this is kind of on topic, but a little bit off. When it comes to the covenant people,
Yeah.
okay, we have two covenants, the old covenant and the new covenant.
Uh-huh.
when Jesus was on the planet,
Right?
the apostles were considered old covenant people?
They were all old covenant until Jesus instituted the new covenant.
Okay, and then that new covenant was not instituted until his death on the cross?
Death, burial, and resurrection.
Okay, and resurrection.
So Acts.
Right. Yes. All right.
Two believers get married.
Right.
The wife begins to find out that the husband is down low.
What does down low mean?
Cheat on her.
Well, I think I know what it means, but
He's down low.
let's not use figures of speech.
Okay, well he's an undercover homosexual.
Oh, that's what it means. Okay, see. All right, so he's a homosexual.
He's a homosexual.
Uh-huh.
And the wife is devastated.
Right.
Is that better or worse, or sickness and health, does she say?
Well, I would say homosexuality also is fornication or adultery, because it's a violation of the Genesis principle of one man and one woman. I personally would not command her to divorce him, but I would understand if she's separated. You know, there's legal separation, which is not divorce. But, pardon me?
Does she have to wait?
No, you get legal separation quicker than you can get divorce. And even in legal separation, you can get guardianship, protection, and financial support. So, Chris?
Okay, now this goes to a little bit.
Nice and loud so everybody can hear.
Let's say you get divorced in the eyes of the government. Does that mean that you're divorced in the eyes of the church necessarily?
Well, the Bible does tell us that we're to obey the laws of the land. So I would say divorced in the eyes of the government is divorced in the eyes of the church. Abandonment is not divorce in the eyes of the world, but it is a serious sin in the eyes of the church.
So then, what would constitute separation?
Legal separation?
Yes.
Legal separation is not divorce because it's not final. It usually provides for opportunities of protection and provision, which then allows there to be counseling and the possibility of reconciliation. So, but you see, today we're getting more and more into what do you do about people that are not married in the eyes of the state, but are common law. For instance, I recently had a chance to lead a couple to Christ, and they are not married. But they've been together for 10 years, so they would be considered common law. But what it does...
They are
Pardon
married.
me?
They are married, then.
That's not ours in Michigan.
Pardon me?
It's not ours in the state of Michigan.
Oh, in Michigan you don't have common law anymore?
No. I thought you had to still file for common law, though. You just can't legally continue, don't you have to?
Yeah, I'm not up on common law.
It's not
Not anymore in Michigan. Okay. So if you're together for 10 years, you're not considered in the eyes of the court common law.
I think you have to have children.
If you have children? All
I
right.
think that might affect.
So
it.
we're gonna say these people have children maybe. But the question is, do I then go to them and say, you know what? You need to get married in the legal sense of the church, of the government, that you should go and get married.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Chris and then Greg.
Sorry.
And then Sharney.
Another one here is, okay, what if they get married by a magistrate as opposed to being married by a pastor or a preacher? Are
Right.
they married in the eyes of God then?
The church recognizes the church recognizes the laws of the land, and some discussion is that God recognizes what marriage was in His eyes, and that is cohabitating.
Okay.
So, Greg, Sharnay, and then back to Norman.
I said that.
Okay.
Now, what do you say, my cousin, now, yeah, he was two believers, they got married, he became a minister. His wife decided she didn't want to be married anymore. He tried to hold out as much as possible not to divorce.
Uh-huh.
Finally gave her a divorce. He was set down by his pastor because he allowed for the divorce to happen.
Your brother allowed it. Your cousin.
My cousin ended up letting her have a divorce.
Right.
Because,
he couldn't fight it.
Right.
She was going to do what she was going to do.
Right. He was set down by his pastor, and then still told if he was to remarry, he still wouldn't be able to be back in his place. He ended up leaving the church, of course. But then in that case, you know, what do? He did not desire the divorce. He didn't do anything
Right,
wrong.
I understand. But the pastor's position was a strong one on remarriage. That you can still continue in ministry, but when you remarry, you're no longer the husband of one wife.
Wasn't he set down? I'm sorry, before?
Yeah, he was set down. When he got the divorce, he was set down, period.
Right, I mean, put down from being a pastor.
Yes,
And said he never could be.
Right, back in.
Right, and that's because that pastor had a strong view that remarriage was not acceptable. There are some that would say that if the innocent party is allowed to remarry after the other one has gone off in excessive fornication or remarried another person.
How would you know?
So, pardon me?
I mean, how would you know if that person did or not? And
Well, you just have to. Usually exes know what exes are doing. So, all right. Norman, was Norman next?
Yeah. You said that the church acknowledges when people are married in the government's eyes, but what if the government allows homosexual marriage? Then does the church recognize?
Then the church doesn't recognize it because it's a violation of God's law.
Okay. Then what if the government twists marriage so much that even between a man and a woman, it's not, it could be marriage just.
Isn't there a passage?
Right, it could be like an open marriage or something like that.
Well, if the government said that, which I thought we still had in Michigan common law, and maybe we do with children, but if the government said, after 10 years and 8 children, your common law marriage, then I think the church must accept that they are married.
Okay.
Because that's not a violation of the one man, one woman. To say to them, you got to go get married before a magistrate or a judge or married in the church, when they would say, well, in the eyes of the government, we are married. So that's my only point. Mike?
Getting back to the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and 1 Corinthians, I just want to make something clear.
Yeah.
So are we saying here tonight that the only instructions that we have clearly not implied is in 1 Corinthians 7, 12 through 15, that the unbelieving wife, who is the innocent party, is free to remarry?
The only window that I see that is commonly held for remarriage is the 1 Corinthians passage. Yes, but there are others who would argue, because they'll use the shorter passage, and they'll say, they use the longer passage, and they'll say, if God permits divorce because of fornication, then God allows remarriage. Because in the controversy between the school of Shammai and Hillel, or the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the background, in their mind, remarriage was always permitted for the innocent person.
But I guess what we're leaving it's implied, and we have to make that decision.
Right. Yeah. You have to make a decision. Now, not this week, but next week, I will give you my opinion and my chart. But I don't want to do it this week because I want you to mull over it more. So Kim will be the last one, then we're going to take a break.
on that thing, common law, whether you've been together 10 years and eight children later, wouldn't that still be trespassing? Exactly, under fornication. That still, you would be breaking God's law in the act of fornication, because the union wasn't married, honored in front of God.
The complication with this is what marriage means in different cultures. See, and under different governments. And of course, if you go into a Muslim country and you've got a Muslim man who has multiple wives and then he becomes a believer, a Christian believer, then what do? So, you know. But it's difficult. But you know, we'll close with this. It's like the guy that went to his doctor, and the doctor says, "I'm sorry, but you've only got 6 months to live."
Right.
And the guy says, 6 months to live? You got to be wrong. He says, "No, I'm pretty sure it's 6 months to live." He says, "Doc, I got to live longer. I got to live longer." He says, "Well, I'll tell you what you can do." He says, he writes this address down. He says, "Here's this little house up in the foothills of Kentucky. There's a widow woman up there with 8 children in a single room house. You go up and marry her and it'll feel like eternity." So, you know, make what you got work and work well if you can. But I do understand that this is not an easy thing. But one man and one woman is what Jesus came back with as God's desire. God understands that sometimes hardness of heart or fornication breaks that ultimate goal, and but you try to maintain it. And I do think that it is there is enough ambiguity to allow people personal convictions in certain situations of a remarriage. So now, next time we have chapter 8 to read, and chapter 13.
This is in fee?
This is in fee. Chapter 8 and chapter 13. And we'll kind of leave it at that. What we don't finish this time, we will be doing more of in advanced hermeneutics. So we come around on this again. All right? We come around on this again. So.
You said 8 and 13?
8 and 13. 8 and 13.